which is being conducted out of the Alaska Science Center. It looks at both marine and terrestrial changes to ecosystems. Today I'll be talking about science that's being conducted under the marine part. The polar bear was listed as a threatened species in 2008, and the walrus, that decision will be made in 2017 as to whether or not that species needs additional protection under the Endangered Species Act. A lot of the science we're doing now on walruses is in preparation for that decision to help inform those decision makers. And a lot of the work I'll show you on polar bears was pursuant to the work we did some years ago to inform that decision. Sometimes people wonder why the USGS, or the Department of Interior, has this authority over a few of the marine mammals in terms of their management and protection. It dates back to the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972. There was sort of a division of labor between NOAA and the Department of Interior, specifically Fish and Wildlife Service. I do want to recognize a lot of the staff of the USGS that work on these two projects. Got a lot of senior scientists, and we have a lot of new early career scientists we're real excited about. Everybody is passionate about their work. They're doing really progressive stuff. I want to give them recognition. I am presenting their work today. So, you know, a foundation of our ability to look at how sea ice interacts with these animals is the fact that we track the animals. And so everything you see today will have a tracking component in it that allows us to align then the places, dates, and times of animals with the sea ice conditions. Female polar bears are collared. They're captured from helicopters using immobilization drugs. And the walruses, here if you can see this tag on the back of the walrus there, they're applied with crossbows. They're kind of a hockey puck-shaped instrument with an arrow with barbs on it, and they're applied by crossbow, either from a zodiac when the walrus are on ice, or by a researcher ever so gently inching his way up to haul-outs. It's a very efficient way to attach a transmitter. Sometimes the animals sleep right through it, but they only tend to stay on for a couple of few months. That's the one downside of that type of attachment. From those data, then we've tagged literally hundreds of animals and received hundreds of thousands of locations, as sort of illustrated by these scatter plots on these maps. I did want to point out that, we tag animals in the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas, and these points that you see here in the East Siberian and Kara and Barents Sea, those are not Alaska animals that moved to that area. These are from collaborative studies with the Russians back in the 1990s. However, this one bear, if you can see, up over the North Pole and down into northern Greenland, that is an Alaskan bear that was tagged in Alaska that emigrated, took up residency north of Greenland. So we get asked this, kind of $99 million question: what are the implications of the current and future sea ice loss to these animals? It's a challenging question. Obviously, we have no precedent from which to work on or draw inference from. There's a lot of uncertainty, but nevertheless, we're challenged with that question because of decisions like Endangered Species Act decisions where they ask us to provide the best available science. In the case of the polar bear, the first thing we wanted to do was to actually quantify or model the relationships between polar bears and the sea ice. We did that through what are called resource selection functions. They come from the family of mark recapture, from use versus availability, what the animals used and chose to occupy versus what they had available. And we cast those questions in terms of habitat covariates, and the ones we chose for polar bear were several from the passive microwave sea ice data sets, the concentration of ice that bears were choosing to use, and how far away from some primary contours of ice, dense ice, there's 75% ice, concentration threshold 50 and 15, and we also some unchanging invariant variables such as the bathymetry, the ocean depth, and the distance to land. We were fortunate to have international collaborators contribute their tracking data to this study. So from Canada, Denmark, and Norway, they also track polar bears, and they contributed data so that we could build a circumpolar model of the entire Arctic basin. And you'll notice that we only used data from the years during an early decade, before the ice had really started to qualitatively change. So we wanted the model to show us an indication of what bears actually prefer or select in the absence of change. And this is just a kind of a cartoon of what the analysis is doing. This yellow dot here represents where the polar bear was. It moves to a new location some days later, represented by the red dot, so that's what it chose. And then within some reasonable area, we say, well, this is what it might have chose, so that's what's available. And when all said and done and that kind of stuff is quantified, then we build a logistic model from those data. And the sort of the most parsimonious model that came from that analysis tells us that bears like to be over here on the left in medium to high concentration ice in shallow waters, near land in the winter, and near the 15% ice edge in other seasons. We build a model for each season because we assume that given the dynamics of the ice and the different things polar bears do in different seasons, they might have different selection criteria in different seasons. And then this bottom line here is to point out that when we compare the data from a separate decade, the next decade, 96 to 06, 7,700 polar bear locations, we found that 82% of those locations were in the top 20% of this resource selection function valued habitat. In other words, we're pretty good. We were quite happy with how well the model was predicting where polar bears would choose to occupy. Here's what it looks like when those functions then are extrapolated. All you need is a map of sea ice concentration on a continuum, along with the ocean depth and distance to land, and for every point on the landscape then, the seascape, you can predict whether or not that would have high RSF value for polar bears, in other words, where you'd expect them to occupy. So the red and the yellow in these maps then represents high value habitat. In the winter, these maps on the left, remember it was near the coast, which is shallow water. When we come over here on the right side, we're looking at some September maps. Here, back in the 85, there was lots of high-value habitat because the ice was over the continental shelf, but as we move into a more recent year, 2005 here, in September, you see less red and yellow, and that's because the ice has retreated back over the continental shelf, so the model doesn't give it as high a quality of a habitat value. So we knew going into this that one of the primary things we wanted to do with this model was to extrapolate it using the general circulation model projections of ice cover so that we could take a look into the future of how the habitat, how the primary habitats for polar bear may change in the future. That's what all these little maps are then, or different GCMs from the CMIP3 archive of ice concentration projections. You can see in the winter here, even at mid-century and late century, there's still a lot of red and yellow in those maps. There's still a lot of polar bear habitat in midwinter in the future because the Arctic basin is still freezing every winter, and there is ice cover from which the polar bears can hunt. But in the summers, you know, it's quite a different story, and there's a lot of variability and uncertainty among the models, but they all portray a picture of diminished ice cover, and you see much less red and yellow in those pictures because the habitat is dramatically reduced in the future summer months. This map is kind of a synopsis of all those individual maps where we took the frequency of occurrence of the kind of primary high-value habitat in each month during an early decade, 2001 to 2010, and compare that to a mid-century decade and do a difference image here. So the red areas are representing net losses of high-value habitat, and blue areas are net gains in polar bear habitat. And kind of the take-home story here is that throughout the circumpolar north, then there are projected net losses of prime polar bear habitat, except for this area in the high Canadian Arctic archipelago region, where actually the models project that polar bear habitat could improve in those areas, and it's probably largely due to the fact that the ice would be less dense. It's real heavy ice right now, and not a lot of polar bears live up there. But in the future, that actually could become better habitat. I'll also point out that our model was not developed or run in these archipelago or kind of seasonalized ecoregions, but polar bears do live in those areas. So the other aspect of, when we ask this question is what might the future hold for polar bears and walruses? A great deal depends on what the future levels of global emissions will be. We try to point this out in almost all of our science that one of the biggest sources of uncertainty is we're not really sure where the global society will go in terms of its CO2 emissions and things. So, as you know, the IPCC is in the CMIP archives. They undertake these different emission scenarios. This red one here, these are the current scenarios, these representative concentration pathways. This red, very bleak and pessimistic look of just unabated emissions going on all the way through the century sort of results in this kind of look here across 12 months of ice cover where you see, a huge summer, a very long summer of ice-free conditions. So I don't want to dwell on this. I think most of you are probably familiar with these different scenarios, but there's a lot of information in this slide if you want to go back and sort of contemplate what this might mean to the ecology of these systems, all the way from primary production on up through food chains and to polar bears and walruses. But because we can't say exactly what some amount of ice loss, what that means to polar bear numbers, we can say what it means to their habitat, but we're not certain how resilient polar bears would be to habitat loss. It's not quite like cutting down an old-growth forest or something where it's pretty clear that you've kind of removed the habitat for some populations of animals to persist. The polar bears are quite resilient. The ice loss is primarily seasonal. And in a way to try and still get at the question of what it may mean to future population status, we ventured into Bayesian network models, which are a way of formalizing all the types of interactions and relationships between all the threats and stressors and things that affect polar bears, and that's what this complex diagram full of nodes and arrows are trying to capture the entire system of everything we think may influence polar bear populations. And what these Bayesian network models allow you to do is to simultaneously incorporate quantified information, if you have it, as well as expert opinion. And it's a nice way to formalize all that into a model that's transparent so that it can be reviewed by others and see how every one of these nodes of influence you can go under and look at the conditional probability tables and see what a panel of experts thought, in terms of would it have a big impact on the polar bears for good or for worse, and you can also prescribe uncertainty into it. If you don't really have any idea how it may affect polar bears, then you can prescribe kind of a uniform probability table. You're not at all certain which direction it may influence polar bears. And all these nodes come down to, a single output node. What is the influence on a population trend? Would polar bears increase, stay the same, decrease, or greatly decrease? And that's kind of the end result of all this formalization of interactions. I've highlighted here that for these models, then up here we input the general circulation model projections of sea ice cast in terms of polar bear, things that are important to polar bears, like how long the ice-free season may last, how far the ice may retreat offshore, et cetera. And we look at all kinds of periods, decades through the century, different forcing scenarios, different areas of the Arctic, et cetera. And it all brings us down to sort of outputs like this. The map here shows 4 different what we call ecoregions for which we applied these models, because there's very different ice dynamics, and the polar bears have evolved with those different types of ice dynamics. We examine these models independently for each of these ecoregions. So each of these 4 panels of bar charts are the outputs for those ecoregions. And each group of these bars are from different types of emission scenarios. This is from the old A1B, or business as usual emission scenario, a mitigation scenario here, and a Y2K, which is basically if everything would have stayed the way it was in the year 2000, it's kind of like a control. And what you don't want to see on these bars are sort of the red and orange, where the model is projecting bears to become rare or extinct. And the take-home that I wanted to point out here is that the mitigation scenario in some parts of the Arctic, if we were to aggressively mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, it would tremendously improve the prospects for polar bear persistence in some areas of the Arctic, whereas other areas it diminishes, it reduces the negative impacts, but it doesn't remove them altogether. This is a reminder that I'm going to transition now from talking about models and future projections to more of the empirical kinds of observational ice data that we've been looking at. Specifically, one I wanted to point out, this was, I saw this in Thorsten Marcus's talk that he gave to us last month. He presented these ICESat-1 maps of ice thickness that Ron Kwok had published in a 2008 paper. What caught my attention when Thorsten was showing these slides was right here in the southern Beaufort Sea, sort of in the U.S.-Canadian border area, this really thick ice in February, March 2005. That just, my eyes immediately drew to that area. And also in 2006, you know, higher than average ice thickness kind of anomalies in this area compared to these other years in the spring of 04 and 07. That caught my attention because I'm familiar with a paper here by Ian Sterling, who is the sort of the Canadian guru of polar bear science. He's an entire career, he's an emeritus science now, and he spent his career in the Beaufort Sea every year looking at and capturing polar bears. And he was compelled to publish a paper after what he saw in the years 2005 and 2006 in his Table 1, which says observations of attempts by polar bears to prey on seals by clawing through solid ice of rafted or buckled floes. I mean, he was quite struck with seeing bleeding from the bear claws and you know, blood around these areas, and these bears struggling to try and dig through very solid, rafted, kind of like plywood laminated ice in those years. And I remember him asking me, is there anything in databases or something that we might get a bigger picture look? And there it was in Ron Kwok's paper. And so that, and the implications about, you know, the ability of bears to capture seals and the ice thickness is even maybe further. There's some circumstantial evidence here in a very new paper that we just published about polar bear survival rates and population estimates in the southern Beaufort Sea. And here you're looking at annual survival rate estimates for adult males and adult females, and you'll see in these years around mid-decade there this, you know, unsustainable drop in adult survival. This is, you know, this type of low survival is unsustainable from a population standpoint, but it only lasted a few years. Normally, the polar bear adult survival is up around 0.95 and above. So, you know, to the extent that polar bears and, you know, the sea ice thickness data may help us survey, you know, a year coming up, I'm thinking about ICESat-2 and how it may help inform and even give us an advanced forecast of what we might find on the ground with regard to polar bear survival and their ability to hunt seals. Another type of ice data is ice motion that the National Snow and Ice Data Center recently released a full version of sea ice motion vectors that are derived from passive microwave and ABHRR and even I think there's a third kind, ice buoy data. And so we're interested in, well, what is the role of ice drift in the movements of bears that we see in our tracking data? So this little schematic here on the right, we receive in our tracking data, you know, what is the ground track, the displacement of the bear on the face of the Earth, but it's actually composed of two vector components. What the bear actually moves combined with the ice drift. So with the ice drift data, we can subtract that from our tracking data to attain what the movement the polar bear an estimate of what it actually moved. So with this kind of red and blue notation here, blue for ice drift and red for bear movement, I'll come back to that in the next slide. But first I want to show you that it's probably pretty evident to you that if all bears just drifted with the ice, I guess they'd all end up out in the Fram Strait or the Atlantic Ocean like a rubber duck. This is an example of where a polar bear shucked her collar, which any polar bear can do if she puts her mind to it. She can shuck the collar off. And now it's adrift. It's essentially an ice buoy. And from time to time, we send our data to Ignatius Rieger so that he can populate the buoy tracking database with some of our shuck collar data. This is what it looks like for free-ranging polar bears when we do that vector subtraction. This is for polar bears that were occupying the Chukchi Sea in sort of a recent decade. And what we're looking at here on the top graph are eastings, just the east-west component of the bear movement of the ice drift. And you can see that the blue, the ice, is always negative. In other words, the ice is always drifting west in prevailing that it drifts west on a monthly summary over a decade. And then you can see the polar bears are, they have to compensate that westerly drift so that they don't all end up in the East Siberian Sea. And we can begin to see which months they're making those compensations. This is the northing. The bottom one is the north-south movement. The bears move a great deal to the north and south in the Chukchi Sea, but ice plays a much smaller role in those movements. And at a very local scale, we've got this new data where we're using the Iridium satellites to communicate GPS and other types of data to us. It's a lot more reliable than the Polar Orbiter Argo system. We tend to get very nice continuous data series, time series of data. So here you're looking at just something from last week, a polar bear being tracked every hour by GPS. And what's maybe of particular interest to the ice scientists are right here when the polar bear takes a rest. It essentially is a surrogate ice buoy at that point. So we see these, they're very distinctive. If you can see these daisy chains of hourly locations while the polar bear is resting. We also get a pretty good inference that the bear was resting during those periods by other sensors that are on board those collars that are on the animals, where we get accelerometer data, which is telling us about the activity of the bear, as well as the temperature inside the collar. And if you look at the gray and the red here, what we see is that when the gray is low, the activity is very low, we often see that the temperature of the transmitter is warm. That's because the bear is kind of curled up and is resting, and that transmitter essentially has a polar bear fur blanket around it. It gets warm. So this is more evidence that the bear is inactive, and so the data becomes these little short bursts of some number of hours, but it's probably very accurate ice motion data at that locale. So I can see, the possibility for some collaboration with physical scientists who are aspiring to model kind of the local scale dynamics of sea ice motion in north of Alaska. I think that kind of work is probably even underway now, or some attempts to model at those scales. And the polar bear data may provide some either control validation data or testing data. The nice thing about the polar bears is they're always relocating themselves back into the southern Beaufort Sea rather than having your drifters drift off into the Chukchi and are no longer relevant to the Beaufort Sea. They keep themselves there. So the trade-off of not having continuous kind of Lagrangian ice motion tracking, but the positive side is that they've relocated themselves back into your study area of interest. This is just kind of a snapshot of some of the recent tracking we're doing right now with those GPS collars. You can see there's a lot of bears scattered across the North Slope right now wearing those kinds of instruments. And then I want to speak to, what does it mean for the polar bears occupying this vast marginal ice zone, sparse, rapidly melting sea ice? And we really don't have an answer to this question, and we really don't have a good way to study it right now, but we want to try to learn more about, what the impacts may be, the implications of occupying that kind of ice, because for bears that don't come ashore, and most bears don't, it's not in their It's not in their nature in the southern Beaufort Sea and Chukchi Sea to come ashore during the summer. That's what they do in Hudson Bay, but most of the bears in the Beaufort and the Chukchi still try to follow the ice pack as it melts and rapidly melts to the north. So these red dots here in this map that from 2008 are the locations of polar bears that are on very, very sparse ice. And some of them are doing a better job of trying to keep with the main ice pack, and others aren't. And it's for bears in this situation here. Here's a beautiful MODIS image, which is rare to get in this part of the world, but it does show us just how sparse the ice is that the bears are occupying, and pretty much their decision as to whether swim now or swim later. One bear I wanted to point out that was quite interesting. This is her annual trek as she keeps pace with the melting ice, and actually, at peak melt here in September on this map, she's this bear that is still with the ice pack, and then you can kind of see she comes back down on the right side here during the autumn in October. She's coming down the ice pack and returning to the coastal areas for the winter. And then she's recaptured here in the spring a year later. And I point her out because she's quite remarkable, and she's not the only one who made a similar trip like this with a cub that survived that journey. So it speaks to the resiliency of these animals in being able to try and cope with these conditions. I think part of her success may be because she stayed with the pack and didn't have to do a major swim with her cub. We have a paper out recently by Anthony Pagano who documented lots and lots of long-distance swims by polar bears from the tracking data. Many of them upwards of several hundred kilometers, taking over a week to make those swims. Some were done with young of the year, and documentation of 100 and maybe 200-kilometer swim with a young of the year. Mother tends to give them a piggyback ride when they're swimming long distances like that. Still, the feats that polar bears have to contend with to deal with the melting ice is some questions we have, and we struggle a bit to try and think about what data we can get to help us better understand how that sparse ice is impacting the bears. This is my transition to quickly go through some of the walrus studies that have been done or that are ongoing. I'll mention that similar to the polar bears, a Bayesian network model has been produced and published. For walruses, obviously, the ice-free months in the Bering and the Chukchi Sea are of primary importance to walrus because that pretty much encompasses their entire annual range. The results of that Bayesian network modeling, when we look out across the century, these last 4 histogram bars of looking at through the 21st century of the population outcomes, what you generally see with the walrus projections are that the probability of a robust population, the dark blue, declines through the century, while the probability of a vulnerable population increases during the century to where there's a lot of just uncertainty or competing probability as to whether the walrus population at the end of the century may be robust, persistent, or vulnerable. But unlike the polar bear, the probability of being rare or extirpated remains quite low. And I'll get back to probably the main reason behind that in a minute. I want to mention that we also did a walrus and sea ice motion study. It was targeted in the Bering Sea, and it was in collaboration with Ron Kwok at JPL using his RadarSat geophysical processor system back in the days when RadarSat was a lot more available, or economically available anyway. It was proving very valuable to ask these questions about, well, do walrus just drift on the ice and let the ice take them to new foraging grounds, or do they relocate and try to stay in maybe in preferred areas? The results of this study was that they relocate. They're not just simply drifting with the ice and letting it passively take them wherever. They relocate, at least in the Bering Sea, to stay probably in preferred foraging areas. These panels of maps show some contemporary results. The top panel here are actual foraging distributions of walruses by month. This is derived from the tracking data, June, July, August, and September. And what is happening currently in September, if you look at the middle row, these are the ice maps, is that the ice is melting completely off the shelf in September. The walruses no longer have a substrate on which to rest on while they're foraging. They have to come ashore. And they're coming ashore by the tens of thousands near Point Lay in the past several years. And from there, they move on to haul-outs in Chukotka. And this is all, because the ice is melting entirely. What we find is that the walruses, when they come ashore, and I just put this in here to point out a website here if you're interested in seeing some remarkable video of these walrus haul-outs, tens of thousands of animals. It's quite remarkable. These are maps then of sea ice and the point locations of walruses, specifically here this map from August 12, 2012, and I'm pointing this out because it's showing a composite with sea ice data. The gray shaded is from ice concentration estimates from the SSMI, and it's similar if we do the same with AMSR. What we see is that as the ice melts, the passive microwave satellites can no longer detect the very sparse ice, but that ice is detected in the National Ice Center product called their Marginal Ice Zone product, which is proving very important for the walrus study because it continues here. If you see these small gray polygons are still being mapped by the ice analysts as having some persistence of sparse ice cover in those areas, and we know that to be true too because we still see our walrus out here very happy over the Hannah Shoal areas, and it's not, until a bit later that even that sparse ice melts away, in which time the walrus will come ashore. It's important that ice data, in terms of the walrus activity budgets, when the ice is still present, say over the Hannah Shoal area, the walrus can use that as a platform from which to forage. And if we look at their activity budget here for this, when they're on the ice, we see that this green bar, they're mostly either foraging or resting. It's a good life, foraging or resting. But when they come ashore and haul out here and then they have to swim out to sea to forage, some are actually making a trip all the way back up to the Hannah Shoal area to forage. And when they make those long coastal movements, they're spending a lot of time not foraging. These are the deadhead movement times. They still get a lot of foraging in, but they're resting very little. And when they kind of forage locally here, the coastal movements here, short movements in green, their activity budget shows us that they're not feeding as much. They're spending a lot of time resting and in transit, but not feeding. So these linkages between the ice, the state of the ice, and the behavior of the walrus giving us activity budget information is very important to the energy expenditure for the walrus. And I bring up the Bayesian model here again because it lays out some components of the walrus's these nodes of influence that are largely unknown and had to be prescribed by expert opinion when this Bayesian model was created. It also shows you where you have information gaps or where additional research could be fruitful. And that's exactly what's going on, is to take the empirical data about activity and what it means to energetics and build an empirical model as to what that may mean. And that's exactly what the Walrus team is doing, is they're building an empirically based model about how the availability of sea ice then goes on to affect metabolic rates and the ability to store fat and et cetera, all the way to what that may mean to survival and reproduction. They're collaborating with zoo animals to get actual measurements from live animals, different diets, things like that. But it is all drawn back to to the sea ice availability, and right now it's the National Ice Center charts that are providing the best estimate of that ice availability. A couple of slides to wrap up on here. I wanted to present a new study that's just beginning. We'll have its first season of field work this year, being led by one of our early career scientists, Vanessa Biela. She's collaborating with some scientists, Ken Dutton, Brian Black at the University of Texas. And she's going to be looking at sort of the trophic level down below these benthic feeders. She's going to be looking at bivalves in the ocean sediments. And it's kind of framed around a model here that maybe some of you are aware of, first proposed by Carol and Carol in 2003, where basically when there's abundant sea ice and a lot of ice algae growing on the bottom of that ice, it tends to put a big surge of primary production into the ocean. When the ice melts, a lot of that primary production falls to the benthos and produces a very benthic-dominated ecosystem compared to a limited ice where there's a lot of early melt and a lot of sunlight that produces a lot of primary production in the water column, a pelagic-dominated system. It did remind me, I put this in here because a couple of months ago, Craig Lee showed us some of that new data from the sea gliders collected over in the Beaufort Sea. I think this new understandings and data that are coming from projects like that are going to contribute to the ability to interpret a study like this on the bivalves. What Vanessa will be doing is collecting long-lived bivalves. Here, the Greenland cockle is one of their target species. And you'll see that there are annual increments in the shells of these animals. And they're kind of like tree rings, and you can see years of, high growth, very productive, and you can see years where the growth rings are very compressed, and those would be probably years of diminished productivity. They'll be taking collections of both long-lived and short-lived species throughout. They're targeting the Chukchi Sea. They want to compare the growth to the sea ice extent to see what relationships there may be there, how synchronous this growth is across broad areas. Is it localized, or are there broad signals in the benthic production? So this is probably USGS's first venture into the other trophic levels that underlie polar bears and walruses. There's also be a study starting up on the primary prey of polar bears, ringed seals, we're starting to put together too. So I thank you for your attention. I know that I went a little bit over, but perhaps some of you want to ask questions.
Okay, David, thank you very much. Maybe I should begin with a couple of comments. The first one is, you mentioned you use the National Ice Center marginal ice dome product. Does the National Ice Center know that you've been using that product? Because they're always looking for endorsements, and they want to know who's using their products.
I'm not sure. I can, to the extent that maybe we've asked some of their experts technical questions about the derivation of the product, they might be aware. But all of those maps, every day they are updated on the web. Their product is drawn through automated scripts directly off their websites and integrated with the tracking data. All automated scripts, and a new map is posted. There's no ongoing tracking right now, but they'll be going out this summer and putting more of those tags out. But that's a good point. We'd be happy to, inform them of the value of the product.
This is Pablo. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're aware of your use, not necessarily of the extent of the use, but we were aware that you would be using our products in looking at these issues. I'm really happy to know that you're using it to a much larger extent than I can.
Yeah, I think your ability to...
Okay, good. That answers my question.
David, this is Guillermo Aguad. Thank you for your presentation. That was great. I have a quick question. Have you compared your results and your findings with the paleo data? From the little I know from 6,000 years ago, I think your results will match very well with what the community knows about distribution of sea ice and polar bears. Have you done some sort of comparison or validation?
Well, we've tried to, read into the paleo literature, particularly with respect to the Holocene warm period. I don't know how well we can compare our contemporary data, to those reconstruction types of analyses. It seemed to us, and correct me if I'm wrong, that when we tried to study the results of those papers, that 6,000 years ago, there may not have been a period when the entire Arctic was completely ice-free. There were areas of the Arctic that were ice-free, but they tended to move around a bit. That, during some number of centuries, it may have been the Western Arctic that was quite ice-free, and then it moved into the Eastern Arctic, but maybe not any long, sustained period of ice-free conditions.
My question was because I saw a similarity between your maps of high probabilities, those red areas, and what we know from 6,000 years ago regarding where polar bears tended to concentrate when there was very little sea ice, and it's basically the same areas that you showed today. So that could be very relevant, I guess, to make some sort of comparison. But just a suggestion.
Oh, I think if you still, I don't know if I'm still sharing my screen, but I think you're referring to this. And that.
Yes, that one, exactly, yes.
If you could email me a DOI or a reference to maybe a key paper that you think is best highlights.
I got this through an oral communication with Tony. I cannot remember his last name. He's USGS Alaska. Tony
Fischbach or Tony DeGange?
DeGange, I think it was. When he gave a presentation last year in 2013 at the CI Symposium that Pablo was hosting, and he mentioned that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, David.
Any other questions or comments for David?
Hi, David. This is Walt Meyer. Really great presentation. A couple things I was going to mention. One, I guess, or a comment. Or a question for you? Are you familiar at all with the University of Colorado's Sea Ice Age product? Because that could be something that might be useful. You showed like the ISAT maps and the thick ice, along the coastline, but that's of course limited in time. But the Ice Age product actually goes back into the 80s, and so if you think that might be useful, I could help you get access to that. It's kind of been around in kind of an ad hoc form, but it actually has been released at NSIDC as an official product. And kind of following on that, I guess a question would be what types of products, at least particularly from my view and NASA's view, I guess, remote sensing products that you would like to see that could be really beneficial to the research in the future. You mentioned ISAT-2, of course, but and that I can see that. But any other products or types of data that you think could be useful?
Well, yeah. To your first question, I haven't seen that the Stone Ice Data Center formalized sort of the distribution of the Ice Age product. I think the fact that it wasn't available in its full time series in the past was one reason maybe why it didn't get into some of our models or considered as a covariate. But in the future, it may well provide us some useful information. I know that it's kind of a synthetic product that's derived from a lot of assumptions. I think locally it may not have a great deal of accuracy, but regionally it probably portrays a good representation of different age classes. So it's on our radar to think about. And for data that would be really useful to us, well, radar, to use a word. The question about the sparse ice, our sort of inability to economically access the higher resolution SAR types of data products, that would be on a wish list. Even the scatterometers seem to have gone offline now. So, you know, to the extent that they were providing some contrast between first-year and multi-year ice. And so in terms of a higher level product, maybe something that tried to get at the state of the ice in its marginal and highly melting kind of state, where passive microwave simply shows you very, very low concentrations, whereas a lot of that's being affected by melt ponds and things that is maybe quite a different habitat. So to the extent that there are clever ways in remote sensing to try and glean more information about what the state of that sparse ice really is. Is it just flows, or is it highly melt ponded? Maybe that might, I don't know how much of that is captured in the NIC ice polygons.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and a very good point about the ice age. That's definitely more of a regional kind of basin scale. Not going to give you real accurate information locally, but it could be of use. And thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Pablo. Things like melt pond distribution, that's not captured at all in our products, but it's something that we really try to look at, particularly using visible and to some extent IR data. It's difficult to capture with synthetic aperture radar. But some good news about SAR, Sentinel-1 is increasing its coverage over the Arctic, and we're starting to get, for example, passes over just off Alaska. So with the advent of Sentinel-1B, I think we're going to have pretty good coverage and quite a bit of radar data and the regions of interest that you may have.
Do you think that data may be more widely available to the scientific community, sort of like it was back in the ERS and RadarSat-1 days?
Yes, that data is completely free. It's free and open to anybody. So yeah, it's going to be freely accessible.
Well, that's great news. Yeah, I think that Martin could attest to all the great science that was being done with at the Alaska SAR facility and things when the data was much more readily available. There's not only about sea ice, but also a lot of terrestrial applications in the Arctic where SAR data were proving valuable.
Okay, any other questions or comments for David? Well, David, maybe I could ask the final question. Going back to your polar bear Bayesian model, it was rather small on my screen. I couldn't read it very well, but I assume that model was not entirely a physical model. It was physics and biology.
Correct. Probably more.
The reason I bring it up is hello.
Hello, Martin. Yeah, I'm listening.
Oh, yeah. The reason I asked mainly was that if it was entirely physical, then you would miss a lot of biological influences on the polar bears, such as prey availability, and you'd have to make assumptions about that.
I would say that the model is mostly biological interactions between predator and prey, and humans and polar bears, and the implications of say, resource development in the Arctic, tourism, hunting polar bears, and defense of life and property. So a lot of those are the primary nodes. There are some links here to papers where you can see the whole model all published and much more legible. and probably the only real physical parts of the model are coming in with the projections of the sea ice from the general circulation models is probably, the real only tangible physical part of the model. There's nothing in here about ocean chemistry. I think the Walrus model had something in it about ocean acidification, which was largely there as a placeholder, but highly uncertain about what the actual effects might be. There's more and more knowledge coming to fruition about ocean acidification in the Arctic, but to answer your question, there's probably very little that is really physically based in the Bayesian model.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, if nobody else has any questions or comments for David, I'd like to thank David very much. I really appreciate a very interesting talk. For all us physical scientists, I think we've all learned a lot about the more biological side of the polar bear and walrus issue. That was great.